In 1997, somebody poisoned the Monte Carlo biscuits. Pesticide laced into the cream filling. A potentially fatal dose, according to forensic testing. A 67-year-old pensioner whose son was in a Queensland prison demanded a ransom be wired to a Swiss bank account. Arnott's pulled every Monte Carlo packet off every shelf in South Australia and Victoria. They published the extortion letter in full-page newspaper ads. The recall cost $22 million. The case against the woman collapsed in 2002 because of insufficient DNA evidence. She walked free. While the most beloved biscuit company in the country was fighting for its survival on the front page of every newspaper, an American soup conglomerate from Camden, New Jersey, moved in and bought out the rest. Campbell's had been a shareholder since the 1980s. By 1994, they already owned 70%. The poisoning weakened the company. The Americans took the last 30. 132 years of Australian ownership ended in a boardroom on the other side of the Pacific. That is what this video is about. The crinkle of the foil as you peeled the top off a fresh packet. The chocolate ridges on the lid of a Tim Tam. The parrot on the perch. The iced Vovo with 2 pink stripes of fondant. The blue family assorted tin you only saw at Christmas. The Scotch finger that snapped down the middle if you held it just right. Every Australian household has a packet of Arnott's in the cupboard right now. 95% of them. 61% of every biscuit sold in this country. The brand is owned by Kohlberg Kravis Roberts, an American private equity fund headquartered on Hudson Yards in Manhattan, part financed by pension money from teachers in Texas and oil money from the Persian Gulf. The factories are leased back from a real estate trust. The buildings William Arnott built do not belong to Arnott's anymore. Here's how it all went wrong. Chapter 1. The man who failed at everything. Before he was the patriarch of Australia's biggest food empire, before the parrot and the Tim Tam and the Homebush factory, he was a failure. Properly. 3 times over. New South Wales colonial records list William Arnott of West Maitland as compounding with his creditors in 1862. That is the polite Victorian phrase for bankruptcy. By February 1865, one of those creditors had run out of patience and demanded the full debt. In April of the same year, his wife, Monica Sinclair, the woman he had met on the boat to Australia 17 years earlier and married at Morpeth, died. She was 36. She left him with stepchildren and his own children to feed. He was 37 years old. The story actually starts on the 6th of December 1827 in a stone village called Pathhead near Kirkcaldy, in the county of Fife on the eastern coast of Scotland. William was the eldest of 8 children of David Millie Arnott and Isabella Arnott. His father David, according to colonial transportation records, had been convicted in Scotland in 1837 of breach of trust, fraud, and embezzlement, and was sent to Australia as a convict. The family followed. William apprenticed as a baker and confectioner in Scotland. On the 24th of October 1847, he and his younger brother David boarded an assisted immigrant ship called the Sir Edward Parry and sailed for Sydney. The voyage took 135 days. He met Monica Sinclair on board. They arrived on the 17th of February 1848. The brothers worked as bakers in Maitland, in the Hunter Valley, north of Sydney. Then, in 1851, gold was discovered at the Turon River. Like 30,000 other men that year, William left for the diggings. He found nothing. He came back to Maitland in 1853. Broker than when he left, and opened his own bakery. For 3 years it worked. Then, in 1856, the Hunter River flooded and destroyed the building. He rebuilt. In 1857, it flooded again. He rebuilt. In 1861, it flooded a 3rd time. By 1862, he was insolvent. By 1864, more floods. By February 1865, his creditor was at the door. By April 1865, his wife was dead. A man at 37 with no money, no wife, 3 failed businesses, and a father who had been transported as a convict. That is who William Arnott was when he made the decision that would build Australia's biscuit empire. He decided to stop trying to rebuild on a floodplain. He moved 65 kilometres east to a coal port called Newcastle and tried one more time. Chapter 2. The Hunter Street Bakery. In September 1865, William Arnott opened a small bakery on Hunter Street, Newcastle. He had no capital. The move was financed by loans from friends. The Australian Dictionary of Biography, in the entry written by Phyllis Mander Jones, records that he repaid every one of those debts within 12 months. 12 months. The same year he opened the bakery, he married Margaret McLean Fleming, a Scottish woman who had emigrated to Morpeth. She would help him run the business. They would have 8 children together. Newcastle in 1865 was the busiest coal port in the Southern Hemisphere. Ships came in empty from Britain and Asia. They left full of black coal from the Hunter Valley fields. The harbour was a forest of masts and steam funnels. Sailors needed food that would not rot on a 6-month voyage. They needed ship's biscuits, hardtack, flour, water, salt, baked twice, kept in a tin, eaten with a knife. William Arnott had spent 14 years failing to sell bread to flooded country towns. Now he started baking ship's biscuits and selling them to the captains who docked at Newcastle. The biscuits did not get destroyed by floods because they did not get rained on. They went to sea. By 1869, he had bought land in Union Street. By 1875, he had built what the family called the William Arnott Steam Biscuit Factory, named for the steam-powered rotary ovens he had imported, which were genuinely cutting-edge industrial equipment for colonial Australia in 1875. The factory could produce biscuits at a scale no Australian baker had attempted. By 1880, he employed 40 people. By 1882, he was sending biscuits by coastal steamer to Sydney, 200 kilometres south. By 1888, the Newcastle Morning Herald was calling Arnott's the largest biscuit producer in the colony of New South Wales. That was the year the parrot arrived. The story goes, and the great-great-great-grandson of William Arnott, in a 2010's ABC radio interview, repeated the family version, that a captain of one of the coal ships brought William a Mexican macaw as a gift on a return voyage from Britain. William's daughter-in-law painted the parrot perched on a T-shaped frame, a biscuit in its claw. The painting was registered as the Arnott's trademark in 1888. The hidden joke in the logo took the family 3 generations to admit. Read it out loud. On his T is the best Polly I see. Honesty is the best policy. By 1894, the factory in Newcastle and a second one in Forest Lodge in Sydney employed nearly 800 people between them. He retired in 1889 to a house at Strathfield in inner West Sydney. He died there on the 22nd of July 1901, aged 73. The Newcastle Morning Herald obituary ran across 4 days that week. He left the company to his sons, and his sons were about to build something ridiculous. Chapter 3. Arnott's Folly. In 1906, William's sons, James Hayden, Leslie Arnott, and Samuel Sinclair Arnott, bought 6.5 acres of land at Homebush, west of Sydney. The site was so far from the city that the Sydney Morning Herald nicknamed the purchase Arnott's Folly. The local population was sparse. Workers would never come out that far. The land would sit empty. The architect was a man named Charles Slatier. The factory was completed in 1908 at a cost of £10,400. The folly was, within 20 years, the largest biscuit factory in the Southern Hemisphere. The locals around Homebush and Concord, pickers, packers, dough mixers, oven hands, became known as Arnott's families. People in the area used to say there were few houses in those suburbs that did not have somebody working at Arnott's. The factory connected directly to the railway. Biscuits left Homebush by goods train were unloaded onto coastal steamers and were delivered to corner shops in every town between Cairns and Hobart. The Hawkesbury River Railway Bridge had opened in 1889 and turned the Sydney to Newcastle journey from days into hours. Arnott's was already exporting to 40 countries by the time the Second World War started. Then the new biscuits started arriving. In 1906, iced Vovos, 2 oblong shortbread biscuits topped with 2 stripes of pink fondant icing, and a stripe of raspberry jam down the middle, dusted with desiccated coconut, the closest thing to a national biscuit Australia would produce. The Irish biscuit firm Jacobs had been making something similar called the Mikado since 1888, but the Vovo became Australian. In 1906, also SAOs. A flat, dry cracker with rows of tiny holes punched in a grid pattern designed for cheese and butter. Generations of Australian children would build SAO sandwiches, with butter melting through the holes, leaving little dots of yellow grease on a plate. Then Scotch fingers, then ginger nuts, which Arnott's uniquely made in 4 different regional recipes, because Queenslanders liked their ginger nuts harder than Victorians, and South Australians liked theirs harder still. By 1910, Arnott's catalogue had 150 different biscuit varieties. In 1926, the Monte Carlo, 2 coconut and golden syrup biscuits, joined by raspberry jam and vanilla cream. The Monte Carlo would, exactly 71 years later, become the most famous poisoned biscuit in Australian history. In 1924, the company introduced the family assorted tin, 7 pounds or 4 pounds of mixed biscuits, sold once a year in the lead up to Christmas. For 3 generations of Australian families, the Arnott's family assorted tin under the tree was the signal that Christmas had started. By the 1930s, Arnott's was producing biscuits at Homebush and a second Newcastle plant. By 1947, the company opened a chocolate-making factory in Marlston, an industrial suburb of Adelaide, on a site at Galway Avenue. Marlston has produced the chocolate coating for every Tim Tam ever made, but the biscuit that would put Arnott's on the world map had not been invented yet. It was a horse race in Kentucky in 1958 that did it. Chapter 4. The Penguin and the Racehorse. This is the story of the Tim Tam, and it has nothing to do with Australia. In 1958, the director of food technology at Arnott's was a man named Ian Norris. The board sent him on a world trip to look at what other biscuit makers were doing. He visited Britain, the United States, Europe. In Britain, he tasted a chocolate-coated biscuit produced by United Biscuits called the Penguin. The Penguin was already an iconic British school lunch biscuit by then, a chocolate sandwich enrobed in chocolate. Ian Norris's notes from that trip have been quoted by Arnott's company historians ever since. He wrote that he wanted to make a better one. The same year, on the 3rd of May 1958, an executive at Arnott's named Ross Arnott, great-grandson of William, attended the 84th running of the Kentucky Derby at Churchill Downs in Louisville, Kentucky. The winning horse was a chocolate-brown 3-year-old colt named Tim Tam. Tim Tam went on to win the Preakness Stakes 2 weeks later, and then ran in the Belmont Stakes in New York. He broke a sesamoid bone in his right hind leg 50 meters from the finish line, and finished second on a fractured leg. The injury ended his racing career. Ross Arnott, in Louisville that day, wrote down the horse's name in a notebook. He thought it was a good name for a biscuit. 6 years later, on the 10th of September 1964, the Tim Tam went on sale in Australian supermarkets. 2 malted biscuits, separated by a thin layer of chocolate cream, enrobed in textured milk chocolate, named after a horse that broke its leg in New York and shaped after a biscuit invented in Britain. It was, on the day it launched, an unremarkable product. It would become the biggest single-line biscuit success in the history of Australian food manufacturing. By the 1970s, the Tim Tam was the best-selling biscuit in Australia. By the 1980s, Arnott's had introduced double coats, dark chocolate, white chocolate, caramel and mint variants. By the 1990s, the so-called Tim Tam Slam. Bite the diagonal corners off a Tim Tam, dip one end in hot coffee, suck the coffee through the biscuit until the chocolate melts, then eat the whole thing in one go before it collapses, had become an unofficial Australian ritual. In 1994, Arnott's cast a 25-year-old Australian theatre actress in a Tim Tam television commercial. She played a woman who asked a genie for a packet of Tim Tams that never ran out. The actress was Kate Blanchett. The commercial paid for her rent for a year. 4 years later, She would be Oscar-nominated for Elizabeth. By the mid-1990s, the Huntingwood plant in Western Sydney was producing 3,000 Tim Tams a minute, 20 tonnes of cream filling and 27 tonnes of chocolate coating poured through the Marsden to Huntingwood supply chain every working day. Arnott's had 97% household penetration, 70% of the Australian biscuit market. Australian families bought 537 million packets of Arnott's biscuits a year, more than 20 packets per person, including babies and pensioners. The company was so embedded in Australian domestic life that nobody could imagine it ever being anything other than Australian. In 1997, two events happened in the same 6-month window that ended that. Chapter 5. The Monte Carlo Poisoning. In early 1997, an extortion letter arrived at Arnott's head office in Sydney. The letter demanded a ransom payment to a Swiss bank account. Attached to the letter was a sample, a packet of Monte Carlo biscuits. The cream filling had been laced with an organophosphate pesticide mixed with a vegetable dye to disguise the discoloration. Forensic laboratory testing later confirmed the dose was sufficient to be lethal to a small child. The threat was specific. If the ransom was not paid, contaminated packets would be placed on supermarket shelves in South Australia and Victoria. Arnott's did something almost no major food company in the world had ever done in response to a product extortion. The chief executive, Chris Roberts, ordered a complete recall of every Monte Carlo biscuit in South Australia and Victoria. And then, instead of trying to manage the news quietly, Arnott's took out full-page advertisements in every major Australian newspaper, publishing the extortion letter in full. The full text. The bank account. The threat. The recall cost the company 22 million Australian dollars. Industry analysts at the time called it a marketing masterclass. Australian consumers backed Arnott's. Sales of Monte Carlos, when they returned to shelves, were higher than before the extortion. Police investigators traced DNA from a saliva sample on the back of a postage stamp on one of the extortion letters. The trace led them to a 67-year-old Queensland woman named Joy Ellen Thomas, the mother of a Queensland prisoner. She was charged with 4 counts of extortion in 1999. In 2002, the case collapsed. In the District Court in Brisbane, Crown Prosecutor Paul Rutledge told the bench that there was insufficient DNA evidence to proceed. The forensic chain of custody on the stamp samples could not be cleanly established. Joy Thomas walked free. She was 69. There is a final, deeply uncomfortable detail to this story that is reported by some Australian sources and disputed by others. According to a contemporaneous claim covered in archived ABC radio reporting and repeated in industry write-ups for years afterwards, an unnamed Swiss bank account was credited with approximately 10 million Australian dollars from Arnott's biscuits in the months that followed the recall. The company has never confirmed the payment. The transfer, if it happened, was never publicly traced. Joy Thomas died, no longer a suspect, and no further suspect was ever charged. The Monte Carlo extortion is taught at Australian business schools as a textbook case in crisis communications. The part that is not taught is what happened later that same year. Chapter 6. The Americans buy in. 6 months after the Monte Carlo recall ended, in late 1997, the Campbell Soup Company of Camden, New Jersey, announced it had acquired the last shares of Arnott's biscuits. This was not a sudden takeover. Campbell's had been quietly buying Arnott's for a decade and a half. The Australian Food Timeline records the timeline. Campbell's had taken its first shareholding in the 1980s. By 1992, the American company owned 33%. By 1994, it owned 70%. Already a controlling majority. The Arnott family had retained an interest in the company throughout, but a failed venture into snack foods in the 1980s and a slump in the Australian economy had progressively pushed family members and Australian institutional shareholders to sell down their stakes. Campbell's was always there to buy. Then came 1997. The Monte Carlo extortion. The recall. The $22 million hit to the bottom line. Difficult economic conditions and the lingering reputational damage of the poisoning further weakened the company. In the boardroom, the remaining holdouts ran out of reasons to keep saying no. Campbell's offered to take the final 30%. The family said yes. The Australian financial press was, by Australian financial press standards, openly distressed. Arnott's was on the short list of brands considered untouchable. Vegemite, Holden, Qantas, Arnott's, the four nouns that defined Australian working-class domestic life. 3 of those 4 would eventually leave Australian ownership. Arnott's was first. Arnott's Biscuits, founded by a bankrupt Scottish baker on Hunter Street in Newcastle in 1865, was now wholly owned by an American soup conglomerate headquartered in New Jersey. Campbell's gave one public commitment when the deal closed. Manufacturing of Arnott's biscuits would remain in Australia. They kept that promise, partially. In 2002, Campbell's closed the Melbourne Brockhoff factory. The Brockhoff plant had been producing biscuits in Melbourne since the 1880s and had been part of the Arnott's Group since the conglomerated mergers of the 1950s. It had been one of the original plants in the Australian Biscuit Company structure. Production was consolidated to Sydney, Adelaide, and Brisbane. Hundreds of Melbourne factory jobs were eliminated. In 2008, Campbell's sold off Arnott's Snack Foods division, the chips and savoury snacks lines including French fries and Cheezels, to a private buyer called the Real McCoy Snack Food Company. The new entity was renamed Snack Brands Australia. The Arnott's name on the savoury snacks aisle was reduced to a sub-brand. The chip business that William's grandsons had built was no longer part of the company. For 17 years, Arnott's was the Tim Tam division of Campbell's Soup. A unit, a revenue line in a quarterly New Jersey earnings call, the polar opposite of what it had been when the family ran it from Sydney. Then, in 2018, Campbell's decided it had a strategy problem of its own. Chapter 7. The KKR Flip. In August 2000, Campbell's Soup announced under shareholder pressure that it would divest its entire international operations. Tim Tams, Iced Vovos, Monte Carlos, Shapes, Tiny Teddies, Jats, SAOs, Scotch Fingers, the entire 153-year history of Arnott's Biscuits was put up for sale alongside Campbell's snack businesses across Asia and Europe. The auction took 11 months. On the 2nd of July 2019, Campbell's confirmed the buyer. The buyer was Kohlberg Kravis Roberts & Company, KKR, one of the 4 largest private equity firms in the world, headquartered at 30 Hudson Yards in Manhattan. The price was $2.2 billion US, approximately 3.2 billion Australian. The Australian press response was fatigued rather than outraged. By 2019, Australians had watched the same private equity playbook applied to brand after brand: Holden, Pacific Brands, Dick Smith, 10 Network. The deal completed on the 23rd of December 2019. The first thing KKR did was a sale-leaseback. In December 2019, a Sydney-listed real estate trust called Centuria Industrial REIT bought 2 Arnott's factories from KKR. The Virginia plant in northeast Brisbane went for $201.8 million Australian dollars. The historic Marston chocolate factory in Adelaide, the building that had been making Tim Tam coating since 1947, went for $24.4 million. KKR took the cash. Arnott's signed back as a tenant. A 30-year lease at Virginia, a 12-year lease at Marston. Arnott's no longer owned the buildings where its biscuits were made. This is the central move of private equity ownership. Take the operating business, sell the real estate, lease the real estate back, use the cash to pay down the debt taken to fund the acquisition. The brand survives, the factories survive, the workers survive. What disappears is the asset base that gives the company any independence from its landlord. Within weeks of the KKR takeover, Arnott's was in a public dispute with Woolworths supermarkets over marketing display fees. Woolworths reportedly wanted to charge Arnott's higher rates for premium shelf positioning. Sources told the Australian Financial Review the dispute had begun before the KKR sale closed. The standoff played out in industry trade press for months. In August 2020, the company changed its corporate name from Arnott's Biscuits Limited to Arnott's Group. The name change reflected a new strategy. Arnott's was no longer just a biscuit company. In December 2020, Arnott's Group acquired the cereal and snack division of Freedom Foods Group for $20 million Australian dollars. Freedom Foods was a publicly listed Australian breakfast cereal company that had collapsed amid an accounting scandal earlier the same year. Arnott's bought it out of distress. The acquisition added cereal manufacturing plants at Leeton and Darlington Point in regional New South Wales and at Shepparton in Victoria. By 2024, Arnott's group recorded total revenue of 1.65 billion Australian dollars. Domestic biscuit volume grew 1.9%, the first positive volume growth in the Australian biscuit category in a decade. Market share grew 1.6 percentage points. By the standards of every metric KKR cares about, the investment had worked. By the standards of what was once on the back of the truck, on his tea is the best polly I see, something had been lost. Chapter 8. The biscuits that disappeared. Honey Jumbles, Adora cream wafers, Bush biscuits, Goldfish, chocolate dessert, Gollywogs, family wafers, Tiny Bickies, Snackrite, TikTok. Every year since the KKR purchase, biscuits that had been on Australian supermarket shelves since the Bob Hawke government have quietly disappeared. In July 2021, Arnott's announced the discontinuation of Honey Jumbles. Honey Jumbles had been in production since the 1920s. They were small, soft honey-flavoured gingerbread cakes, topped with pink or white royal icing, sold in two-tone packets. They were unprofitable. Volumes had been declining for years. KKR's strategy, telegraphed by industry analysts at the time of the 2019 sale, was to identify what private equity executives call lazy assets, long-tail product lines that consumed shelf space, factory time, and ingredient supply chains without contributing meaningful margin. Honey Jumbles were lazy. Professor Daniel Sampson of the University of Melbourne, an expert in manufacturing operations who had been quoted in the Australian Financial Review during the 2019 sale, had predicted exactly this within 48 hours of the KKR deal closing. He told the AFR that one way to increase a company's value was to eliminate niche lines and focus on volume products. He named Orange Slice Biscuits and Milk Arrowroot as candidates for the chop. Milk Arrowroot was the original Arnott's biscuit. The biscuit William Arnott himself launched in 1882, marketed as children's food, made with arrowroot starch flour. It was the foundation product on which the empire was built. Milk Arrowroot survives at the time of writing. It is no longer in many of the variety packs. The shelf footprint has been reduced. It has been quietly described in trade press as under review. The iced Vovo, by contrast, has been protected. Iced Vovos appear on every variety pack. The brand has been used in licensing deals. There is an iced Vovo Krispy Kreme donut, an iced Vovo cake mix, an iced Vovo gelato. Iced Vovos still produce 1906-era biscuits in 2025 packaging. The strategy is rational. If you are running a private equity-owned biscuit conglomerate, optimizing for the highest possible cash flow before exit, you keep the icons that drive licensing revenue, and you eliminate the long-tail lines that take up factory time. There is no business case for Honey Jumbles. There is no business case for Bush biscuits. The 1888 Arnott's factory in Newcastle was a generalist biscuit operation that produced 150 varieties because William Arnott's sons believed in serving every regional Australian taste. The 2025 Arnott's Group is an investment asset. It produces what generates margin. The other thing that disappeared, quieter than the biscuits, was ownership of the floor itself, the Huntingwood plant, the Virginia plant, the Marsden plant, the Brisbane offices. After the 2019 sale leasebacks to Centuria Industrial REIT, Arnott's was paying rent on the buildings William Arnott's grandsons had built. 12-year lease at Marsden, 30-year lease at Virginia. Centuria collects approximately 5.75% yield on the assets every year. That money no longer reinvests inside the company. It moves up to a Sydney-listed real estate trust whose own unit holders include offshore pension funds, sovereign wealth investors, and superannuation managers who have nothing to do with biscuits. The brand is more profitable than it has ever been. The buildings belong to somebody else. This is the trade. Chapter 9. The man who never came back. There is a moment in the William Arnott story that the company website does not include, and the official corporate history elides. It is the moment between February 1865 and September 1865. 8 months. The flooded bakery in Maitland is gone. The first wife is dead. The creditor has demanded the debt. William Arnott has not yet opened the Hunter Street bakery. He is, in the gap, simply a 37-year-old man who has lost everything for the third time. He could have got on a ship. Plenty of failed colonial men did. Australian colonial bankruptcy registers are full of Scottish names that vanish from the colony in the year following insolvency. They went home. They went to New Zealand. They went to South Africa. They started again somewhere their creditors could not find them. William Arnott did not. He moved 65 kilometres. He stayed inside the country he had failed in 3 times. He started again with borrowed money on a Coalport high street and within 12 months had paid back every person who lent him a shilling. It is the part of his story that is the most Australian thing about him. By contrast, KKR is a private equity fund. Private equity funds, as a structural matter, are not long-term holders. The standard hold period for a buyout fund acquisition is 5 to 7 years. Industry analysts at the time of the 2019 deal, including private equity expert Brendan Wykes of Holding Redlich, quoted in the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, said KKR would run the usual mantra: improve operations, cut costs, exit at a profit. The exit was projected for somewhere between 2024 and 2026. As of writing, no exit has been announced. The biscuit market has cooled. Inflation has compressed margins. The exit window has slipped. When it comes, and it will come, because that is what private equity funds do. They do not run companies forever. Arnott's will passed to its 5th owner in 28 years. Family, Campbell's, KKR. Whoever buys it next. The Homebush factory, the one the locals called Arnott's Folly, when the Sons bought the land in 1906, closed in 1997. Production moved to Huntingwood. The administrative offices of Arnott's Group still operate from a building at 11 George Street, Homebush, on a corner of the original site. There is no plaque, no heritage listing, no public mention that the largest biscuit factory in the Southern Hemisphere stood there for 90 years. The Marston Chocolate Factory in Adelaide is owned by Centuria Industrial REIT. The Virginia factory in Brisbane is owned by Centuria Industrial REIT. Arnott's Group is a tenant in the buildings where its biscuits and its chocolate are made. The parrot is still on the packet. Chapter 10. What survived? Stand in any aisle of any Coles or Woolworths in Australia today, in any town from Cairns to Hobart, from Perth to Byron Bay, and you will find a section of shelving devoted entirely to the Arnott's range. Tim Tams, original, dark, double coat, white, caramel, chewy, mint, iced Vovos, Monte Carlos, Scotch fingers, ginger nuts in regional variants. Shapes, barbecue, pizza, cheddar, savoury. Yats, tiny teddies in the lunchboxes of every primary school child in the country. The brand, in every metric you can measure with a barcode scanner, has never been stronger. 3,000 Tim Tams a minute coming off the line at Huntingwood. 61% of the Australian biscuit market. 95% household penetration. $1.65 billion a year in revenue. Exports to 40 countries. A Pepperidge Farm distribution deal that puts Tim Tams in every Walmart in America under the slogan, Australia's favourite cookie, spelled the American way. Arnott's is making more biscuits in more countries for more customers than it ever has. The empire survived. The ownership did not. William Arnott sailed for Australia in 1847 because Scotland could not employ him. He started a bakery in 1865 because Australia would not let him fail again. He died in 1901 with a company that bore the name of an immigrant family who had built something nobody could buy. In 1997, an American soup company bought it. In 2019, an American private equity fund bought it. In whatever year is coming, somebody else will buy it. The biscuits will keep arriving. The trucks will keep rolling out of Huntingwood. The parrot will stay on the side of the packet. The joke about honesty will stay buried in the lettering only Arnott's descendants now remember. The Tim Tam will keep being slammed into hot coffee in kitchens from Broome to Burnie. The family assorted tin will keep showing up at Christmas. Smaller every year, fewer varieties every year, less Australian every year. But it will be there. The brand survived. The empire, the family, the buildings, the country it belonged to, did not.